What would you do if the story of your life, the one you were told since childhood, suddenly crumbled, revealing a web of deception that stole the truth about who you are? Is it possible to forgive those who, out of love or fear, built your identity on a lie? Tell us, from what city are you joining us today? And if an unexpected revelation ever shook the foundations of your own story, get ready for a narrative of search, confrontation, and the painful unveiling of a truth that, though raw, is necessary for a complete identity. The afternoon sun filtered through the curtains of his Seattle studio, illuminating the framed diplomas hanging on the wall. At 30 years old, Daniel Chen had it all: a successful career as a software engineer, a comfortable life, and the unconditional love of his parents, Susan and Robert Chen. He had grown up knowing he was adopted from China, a fact his adoptive parents, American Chinese, always handled with the utmost openness. They told him he had been an abandoned baby on the steps of a hospital in Beijing during the one-child policy era, and that they, unable to have children of their own, had adopted him through a legal process. Daniel had always felt grateful for that opportunity. His parents had raised him in a bilingual home, celebrating both his Chinese heritage and his American upbringing. He went to Chinese school on Saturdays, ate homemade dumplings, and celebrated Lunar New Year with the same devotion as Thanksgiving. However, a pang of curiosity about his biological origins was always there, a silent question that, over the years, grew more persistent. Who were his biological parents, and why had they abandoned him? The 1980s and 1990s were a time of great change and challenge in China. The one-child policy was enforced with relentless rigidity, especially in cities, leading to desperate situations for many families. For Susan and Robert Chen, a Chinese-American couple living in the United States, adoption had become the only path to parenthood. They had tried for years to adopt in China, facing long waiting lists and complex bureaucracy. In 1994, they received a call from an adoption agency that worked with orphanages in Beijing. They were offered a baby boy, born under complicated circumstances in Sichuan province, not Beijing. They were given a brief file indicating that the baby had been surrendered to the orphanage by his biological parents, who couldn't raise him due to poverty. However, what Susan and Robert didn't know then, or perhaps chose not to know in their desperation, was that the file they received was fabricated. The agency, in its eagerness to expedite adoptions and circumvent increasingly strict regulations, had manufactured documents that concealed the true stories of many children. In Daniel's case, it hadn't been an abandonment in Beijing, nor had his parents been anonymous peasants from Sichuan who gave him up due to poverty. The truth was far more complex and dramatic. Dr. Wei Feng, a corrupt intermediary working with the agency, had acquired Daniel from a group of baby traffickers operating in a rural area of Sichuan, where children were bought from impoverished families or, in darker cases, stolen. Daniel's file had been forged to show a clean abandonment in Beijing, a more accessible place with fewer questions. This was the dramatic and murky context surrounding Daniel's birth and adoption, a secret his adoptive parents, in their yearning to be parents and their trust in the agency, never suspected, or perhaps chose to ignore to protect themselves from the painful background. Do you think the desperation to become a parent can cloud judgment to that extent? Daniel's life in Seattle was filled with details that gave him an apparently solid identity. He remembered the smell of wet earth after rain in his backyard, the taste of the homemade baozi his mother made every Sunday, the sound of the Mandarin television his father watched at night. However, the few documents from his adoption, a blurry photograph of the Beijing orphanage and a birth certificate with minimal information, created a persistent unease. There were no details about his biological parents, not even a description. His eyes, an unusual hazel color for many ethnic Chinese, and his slightly lighter hair had always sparked his curiosity, but his adoptive parents attributed these characteristics to some distant heritage, or simply called them peculiarities. The suspense in Daniel's life began when, at 28, he decided to take an ancestry DNA test. He wanted to know more about his origins, search for distant cousins, perhaps find a clue about his biological family. The results, however, were a bombshell. The test not only showed a percentage of European ancestry that couldn't be explained by his adoptive Chinese heritage, but also revealed that his genetic markers did not match the general population of Beijing or Sichuan. They indicated a region further south, perhaps Guizhou or Yunnan. And most disturbingly, his DNA showed a very close match, that of a paternal aunt, with a woman who had uploaded her profile to a Chinese DNA database, originating from a remote village in Guizhou. Not Sichuan, not Beijing. The revelation hit him with the force of an earthquake. Why the Beijing orphanage if he was from Guizhou? And the European ancestry? The mystery deepened. Daniel, with a mix of excitement and growing anxiety, contacted the woman in Guizhou, the supposed aunt. She, a gentle elderly woman, was cautious at first, but Daniel's story and the DNA evidence moved her. She told him a heartbreaking story. Her brother, a man named Chen Wei, Daniel's same surname, had had a child with a foreign woman, a European student who had visited their village many years earlier. The relationship had been a secret, a forbidden love. When the woman returned to her country, she left the baby with Chen Wei. But life was hard, and Chen Wei, in his desperation, had been tricked by traffickers who promised they would take his son to a wealthy family in the city, where he would have a better life, but in exchange for money. The traffickers had disappeared with the baby, and Chen Wei, heartbroken, never heard from him again. The elderly woman hesitated to speak of this due to family shame and fear, but Daniel's sincerity convinced her. The abandonment in Beijing, the poverty, it had all been a deception. He had been bought. Dr. Wei Feng had been the final link in that chain. How would you process such a painful truth about your own origin, so different from what you always believed? The cultural connection to this story is profound. In China, family ties are sacred, and the concept of deception about a child's origin, especially for profit, is an atrocious betrayal that leaves lasting scars. The shame associated with the birth of a child by a foreign father in certain rural communities of that era, or the desperation that led biological parents to unthinkable decisions, created a dramatic context where secrets could proliferate. Daniel, armed with the truth and the location of his biological father, Chen Wei, found himself at a crossroads. He needed to confront his adoptive parents, Susan and Robert. The conversation was one of the most difficult of their lives. Daniel presented them with the DNA evidence, the forged documents he had managed to unearth, and the story his aunt had told him. Susan and Robert, devastated, couldn't hide the truth. They confessed that the adoption agency had pressured them, that they had been given simplified documents and assured that everything was legal. In their desperation to become parents, they had ignored the red flags, blinded by the longing for a child. They felt ashamed, but also deeply sorry for having hidden the truth from Daniel. "We didn't want you to know you had been bought, Daniel. We wanted you to feel loved and wanted, that your origin wasn't a blemish," Robert explained through tears. The confrontation was painful but necessary. The truth, though hurtful, was the beginning of catharsis. Daniel traveled to the remote village in Guizhou to meet his biological father, Chen Wei. It was a bittersweet encounter. Chen Wei, an elderly man marked by life, burst into tears upon seeing his lost son, apologizing again and again for the decision that led him to hand him over to the traffickers. For Daniel, seeing the remorse and love in his biological father's eyes was liberating. He understood the context, the desperation that led to that decision, and while he didn't fully forgive it, he could understand it. The inspiring and hopeful ending to this story was not a fairy tale where all problems disappear, but one of reconciliation and growth. Daniel did not abandon his adoptive parents. He loved them deeply, and they had genuinely repented, opening their hearts and their history. Over time, they managed to rebuild trust based on honesty. Daniel also began to build a bridge with his biological family in China, visiting them, learning about his roots, about his biological father's life, and the tragedy of his biological mother. He dedicated himself to raising awareness about the dangers of human trafficking and irregularities in adoptions, so that others wouldn't have to live a similar deception. Daniel, the falsified son, found his truth and in doing so, discovered the strength of identity in all its complexity. The cultural connection with his Chinese roots deepened as he understood his biological father's story. His European ancestry opened a new line of investigation into his biological mother, a new chapter in his personal quest, but now armed with the truth and the strength of an extended family that supported him across all continents. Daniel's story became a testament that truth, however painful, is the only path to true freedom and personal completeness. Do you believe that truth, however harsh, is always necessary for healing? What would you do to discover your own roots, regardless of the cost?